My name is Dennis Speed, and on behalf of the LaRouche Political Action Committee, I want to welcome everybody here for today's Saturday dialogue with Lyndon LaRouche. And today will be a dialogue directly with Lyndon LaRouche. As I think everyone here knows, and many of the people who are watching this will find out, next week we will be conducting a set of memorial functions around Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away on February 12th of this year. But we've termed that the triumph of Lyndon LaRouche. There's a presidential election process that is actually always underway in the United States in this period, and is specifically underway for the presidency of 2020. Announcements are already being made, and I believe that President Donald Trump will be making an announcement later this month of his running for the re-election to the presidency. Lyndon LaRouche conducted a presidential campaign which was unique in American history. It spanned over 8 cycles of the presidency, but it was always a single campaign. Unfortunately for the American people, what he was doing in that campaign was often obscured. What we're going to do is to begin today's session by letting you hear and experience how Lyndon LaRouche campaigned for the United States presidency. This was a presentation given to a group in Queens in 2003. It was a Pakistani educational group of about 500 persons that listened to LaRouche on that occasion. And so we will begin today by letting Lynn open up, if you will, the presidential campaign of 2020 in his own words.
Friends, if you look around the world today, you have 2 pictures. One, a fearful one, a spread of war, threat of war, terror. On the other hand, in Asia in particular, Eurasia in general, there's a new movement, new cooperation among the nations of Asia, steps toward cooperation. Pakistan, India, China, Southeast Asia, Iran, nations of Central Asia, Russia, moving toward Europe. The world is in a great crisis. Great economic crisis. The financial system is in danger of collapse and will collapse. But we can fix that. Governments have the power to fix those kinds of problems. And life will go on. The problem is, above all, is the mind of the people of the world. And is the case of Pakistan, as you have emphasized with your program, the supportive education program. The problem is, look at the faces of the poor of the world. Not only Pakistan, but the poor of India, the poor of Southeast Asia. And you look in the eyes of poverty, or poverty in Africa. What do you see? You see a mind which is the human mind, which is capable of doing everything every other human mind can do in general. But you see that the lack of education, the lack of hope, the lack of connection is like a prison. It's not only a prison in denying them the knowledge they need to have the skills to produce, but it's a psychological prison, a spiritual prison. They don't know the world in which they live. The world in which they live in the large is a stranger. It's a frightening stranger. And so therefore, when it comes to the kind of project with which you are concerned here tonight, the project of education, for the poor, especially of Pakistan, who otherwise would not have the education that you're working to provide for them. We think that the spiritual goal is almost as important, or maybe more important, than the economic goal. How are we going to save Pakistan from the things that frighten it? It's largely poverty. Since the split off of Bangladesh, Pakistan has been a poor country, lacking independent resources as the type it had before. The people become poor. They become poorer. I recall the case, I was involved in the case of Prime Minister Bhutto. Prime Minister Bhutto was involved in an affair that I was pushing in Colombo, Sri Lanka in 1975. We had a meeting of the Non-Aligned Nations Group who resolved on a just new world economic order. And every one of the leaders who participated in a leading role in Asia were either killed, as Mr. Buddha was killed, or they were put out of office, as Mrs. Bandanayake of Sri Lanka, as Mrs. Gandhi of India, and so forth. The project failed, but the desire for a just new world economic order persists today and is more alive in a sense than ever before, with a new spirit of cooperation in Asia. So the problem we face is giving the poor, who are many in Asia, giving them a sense of economic opportunity, a sense of peace because they have something to fight for. Peace to have the opportunity to lead distant lives, not to waste their lives in war, in conflicts of that nature. Without this, without education, they can't do it. They cannot participate. We will leave the poor of the world still poor. For example, in the history of mankind until modern times, the fate of man was a very bad one. A few people who ruled hunted some people down as wild animals and killed them or captured them. Other men they herded as we herd cattle. And they were not allowed to rise much above the status of cattle. Their humanity was denied them. We still around the world today have poor who are being denied humanity. They're being denied the knowledge to elevate themselves above the level of virtual human cattle, who are sometimes cared for well, sometimes not. But in a sense, they go into the fields, they go into the stall, they are milked, they work as animals do. And the function of education is both to provide the individual with the ability to participate efficiently in society, but also to realize their potential as a human being. The other aspect of it, which is important as I see it around the world today, is pessimism. In the United States, there is great pessimism. There's a fiction of pessimism in politics. We sometimes call corruption in politics, and it is corruption, is a fruit of pessimism. People say you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. You can't change the way things are going. You can't improve the political system. You can't solve the problems. You've got to learn to live with the problems. Pessimism. And pessimism leads to corruption. And around the world, the same problem. Pessimism. Pessimism in Africa, especially in black Africa. Pessimism in Europe. Pessimism in Eastern Europe. And less so in China. China's more confident. But fear in Korea. Fear what might happen. Fear in Japan. So the most important thing, in my view, in my experience, in leadership is optimism. Not arbitrary optimism, not false optimism, but knowledgeable optimism. The knowledge that we can, if we will, can do the things that have to be done. And optimism sometimes comes as a result of education. When a child relives some of the great inventions and discoveries of the past, or learns more about the world, the child becomes optimistic in the sense that people before him or her were able to do something. And they get a sense, if I know, I can do something. I remember when I was a child, growing up later, when young children would be brought into a family circle, what would the older people ask the child? What are you going to do when you grow up? And the child in my time would often have a very clear image. I'm going to do this. Why are you going to do that? What's your purpose? The child would have a sense of what they were going to do. They were optimistic. I know that in the period of World War II, when the United States had gone through a great period of pessimism in the 1920s and early 1930s. We began to come out of that pessimism during the period of the 1930s and the war. We were able to meet the challenge of war and the challenge of the hope of peace which Roosevelt represented, because there was optimism in the people. I saw things happen in wartime, under wartime conditions, which expressed optimism. People would do what they thought was impossible because they were optimistic. And the function, I think, of education, especially the education in poor countries, is to give the child the basis for belief in optimism, for the belief that we can do things, that the belief that by cooperating we can make things different, we can change things for the better. And that's what I look for. I'm privileged now because of my work internationally in dealing with countries in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, Europe, elsewhere. I see that there's the possibility of optimism. But then I see, when I look at the poor countries, such as Pakistan and India, which have many poor, even though many are not poor, but many poor, I think what will happen to the effort to build peace in this part of the world if we leave the mass of the population, the majority of the population, ignorant and poor, with a sense of hopelessness that can become a disease that can destroy all our wonderful aspirations. So I must say briefly, that to be as brief as possible, I can say much more about many things, and maybe you would like to ask me about some of these things later tonight. That this is a very worthy cause. It's a small part of what is needed. But sometimes we set an example by a small effort and hope that others will be inspired by what is accomplished by the small effort, and hope that therefore that example will inspire others to do more. And I shall go on as I will. If you ask me about it later tonight, I'll tell you what I'm going to do about this situation. I'm confident that the United States can change. It can change from what it is now. It can change quickly. What we're doing now is wrong, but it can change. It doesn't have to go on like this. And I'm determined to bring that change about. And being an older man, I have nothing to fear. And therefore, I can go ahead and do it. I'll try to do it at least. But I think one should not be pessimistic. I know what goes on in the United States. I know the persecution of so-called minority groups. I know the persecution of Islamic populations, of people from Islamic backgrounds. This is a melting pot country. We have everybody in this country. This is not a country of Anglo-Saxons. It's a melting pot nation from all parts of the world: Chinese, Koreans, Mexican Americans, Spanish-speaking Americans of all kinds, all branches of Europe, Turkey, the Middle East, Egypt. They're all here. This is a melting pot country in which the richness of the country is the fact that we're a melting pot country. We live together, and by living together with cultures and different backgrounds, we have an understanding of what peace means. It means we're united by a common purpose to create a society and a world that works in a certain way. I'm convinced we can do it. And I'm convinced that you should be optimistic, too, with me. I think we can change this. I'm determined to change it. I think we can succeed. And what you're doing in this cause for youth, for the young people in Pakistan, is just one more of those things, those good things that is done, which make the world a better place to live in. Thank you.
That is how you campaign for the presidency. That's the necessary standard. But there's another specific process that is required of every American presidential candidate. It is the first qualification of the American presidency, and it is that the American president must always oppose the Anglo-Dutch imperial system. Otherwise, the president commits treason against the American Constitution. as well as the American people. Now, this point is a distinctive honor of Lyndon LaRouche, that he did this throughout the entire set of his presidential campaigns. That is, if you look at every one of the campaigns, among many things that you will find that are consistent, this theme was always present. And in virtually every other presidential candidate, it was absent. And you cannot run, not properly, for the presidency of the United States unless you campaign against the Anglo-Dutch imperial system. And that was LaRouche's chosen place in history as a presidential candidate. Let's go to our first photo, first visual. The battle on the side of the anti-colonial forces of the world, which is one that was represented by Alexander Hamilton's very first documents, the 4 documents that he wrote to form the Treasury of the United States, and which was the actual American Revolution. There was a war, there was a Revolutionary War, but the American Revolution was the American presidency, and the Constitution and so forth, of course, that allowed that presidency to come into being. And without that American presidency and the presidential system as established by Hamilton with Washington, under the direct supervision of Benjamin Franklin, there is no American Revolution. There's an American Revolutionary War, but the war is not the revolution. The revolution is the presidency, the presidential system, and specifically the 4 documents of Alexander Hamilton, which are anti-colonial revolutionary statements of how economies are utilized, the power of economies is utilized to develop the human mind and the human potential. In 1945, 44, 45, in a period of that time when Franklin Roosevelt was still president, that war was specifically one that you'll hear a bit about later, but I'll just say here you see Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. There was a design for the world that the President of the United States wished to see come into being, but he died, and that design did not occur. After his death in 1945, there were changes also in the British governmental system. Let's go to the next one. And some people came into power that Americans don't know much about, but others from Britain know quite a bit about. This individual is a man by the name of Ernst Bevin. Next, please. This is a person named John Wesley Snyder, who was the Secretary of Treasury of the United States and the closest person to Harry Truman. Next, please. This is Lord Bertrand Russell. And next, please. And this is a person who wasn't there, but who is the spiritual, I won't call him spiritual ancestor of everybody, because Bertrand Russell was born in 1872, so you sort of have to count Bertrand Russell and Cecil Rhodes as co-equal and co-evil, in this case, individuals. But this is Cecil Rhodes, whose famous designs for the colonization and destruction of Africa are or essentially echo what you heard Lyndon LaRouche talk about a little bit earlier, about the idea that there are some people who are born to rule and there are some people who are born to be ruled. That was the world that the British society sought to put into motion right after the death of Roosevelt. It's important to recognize that the way that this was done is it was done by the socialists, by the Socialist Labor Party, and by Lord Bertrand Russell, who was also a socialist. That is, he was a member of the House of Lords, but he was Labor Party. And it was the Labor Party that was vociferously anti-Russian. That it was, in other words, it was the people, Ernest Bevin in specific, who urged the actions together with Bertrand Russell, including the dropping of a nuclear bomb as fast as possible on Russia, on the Soviet Union. This was made official in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1946 October, where Bertrand Russell explicitly called for it. But it's important to recognize that that is the that initiative, that set of initiatives, were not being taken by Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was thrown out of office in 1945. He didn't come back until 1951. The people that were tasked with creating what became known as not merely the Cold War, but the anti-Russia policy, were the people from the Labor Party. Now, obviously, Winston Churchill gave the speech in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, which announced the Iron Curtain. And so I'm not in any way trying to absolve Winston Churchill of imperial designs. I'm simply saying, and I want to make it clear, that the concept of imperialism and the concept of the continuance of the British Empire was a shared goal of all imperial forces and all political forces that dominated Great Britain immediately after the war. In the book, Grand Improvisation, America Confronts the British Superpower, author Derek Liebert, who is a historian from Georgetown University, points out, quote, Britain was the original definition of a superpower when the term was coined in 1944. It meant a great power with great mobility of power, meaning that it existed everywhere. When World War II ended, the expectation was that the Americans would come home fast. We had pledged to bring our 3 million troops in Europe home within 2 years. The British expected at the end of World War II that the world to follow would be a British-dominated world. And they kept 1 million people in arms. Right now, I believe the American military might be 1.5 million to 2 million people, it's someplace in that range. The world at that time had 2 billion people. So you have to think about the British having 1 million in arms. That's without colonial reserves. And that remained the case. The British were leaders in the field of computers, in the field of jet planes, and the field of nuclear power at the end of the Second World War, the fields of the future. And it was their systematic sabotage of the presidency through Harry Truman and his Secretary of Treasury, John Wesley Snyder. I just put that in because what you want to know is that that was the individual that ran the Marshall Plan, and he was the person that specifically decided the firing of Douglas MacArthur. He was the closest friend of Harry Truman and was essentially the manager of the United States in the period of the Truman administration. So to understand some things about that, we just wanted to interpolate that. But there is a larger picture that this picture yields to. We're going to go back for a moment here to define this, and we're going to have LaRouche do this. Though the Anglo-Dutch imperial system is the latest version of empire, and it's the one that we are specifically charged to defeat, it's not the first. There have been previous empires, specifically the Venetian Empire, which gave birth to the Dutch and British empires, and that itself was part of the Roman Empire. It's a bunch of the Romans who basically, after depopulating much of the world, sort of collapsed into the lagoons of Venice and then began the same process, extending the same process as much as they could in other directions. And of course, there are preceding empires as well. The LaRouche took his place, his chosen place in history, on the side of anti-colonial forces and those who were opposed to the oppression of people and the turning of people into chattel, as he already stated. He believed that man was not a beast. But historically, there have been two factions. We've referred to them as the faction of Plato versus the faction of Aristotle. In mythology, It's referred to as the difference between the faction of Zeus, the chief god of Olympus, and Prometheus, the god who gave man language, fire, agriculture, science, and technology, and the arts. And this is referred to in terms of terms as the battle between the oligarchy or oligarchism and republic, the republican forces. And the idea of the republic is that it is the poets who are the legislators of the world. It is the people with the grand ideas and the ideas that allow the masses of people to rise above any station to which they've been assigned. LaRouche discussed this in response to a question. We've taken a portion of the question, but he had a very specific characterization of this faction, and we're going to play that for you now.
And again, tonight, you state that the only standard by which the relative progress or decline of a human society can be measured is the net increase or decrease of energy flux density applied per capita, and that any culture which fails to express this willful increase in energy flux density and upward evolution will tend toward a self-extinction. So I'd like to ask you, what would you say to those who refuse to take the necessary actions today to reverse this 50-year collapse in the productive powers of our nation, and instead insist on submitting to a Zeusian agenda that they may even disagree with personally, but submit to an agenda of depopulation and the so-called green policy?
Okay. Well, it's very simple and it's ancient. It's called Satanism, which is otherwise known as Zeus. The policy, and the Satanism is the policy of the British Queen, for example, today. The British Queen has a policy which has been in effect, especially since the period of the Copenhagen events, of saying reducing the human population from 7 billion people to less than 1. And the targets are indicated to be significantly less than 1. We have now since actually seen that since the beginning of the last century, with the measures taken to substitute arithmetic for science, has caused, Bertrand Russell, of course, was the leading figure in this. He was practically the Satan of the 20th century. And he could be fairly called the true Satan of the 17th century. Maybe the real Satan was sleeping or drunk or something at the time, but he was in there to do the job. So therefore, what you have then, you say, well, now what? We have kingdoms like that. We have empires like that. The Zeusian empire is not a mythological empire. There's mythology around the existence of this culture. But it was not a mythological state. It was a mythologized form of society, an actual society. And this society is found turning up in all parts of the earth, these types. The Roman Empire, for example, is an example of that. The Roman Empire was a Zeusian system. The British Empire was modeled explicitly on the same system, on the Zeusian system, the Roman imperial system. And it was that from the beginning. He took the exact formulas of the Roman Empire and said those are the policies of the British Empire. And that's exactly what happened from about September or so forth of that year. The British Empire was dedicated to that purpose. And it occurred as a whole process of the Dutch evil of the previous century, of the latter part of the previous century. And then the Dutch again moved in, and then they created the British Empire. It was really the Dutch Empire, who had killed the Irish and so forth first, as a part of their testament. And so the British and the Dutch Empire are one and the same thing. This is the relic of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire has declared itself devoted to reducing the human population from 7 billion people, estimated recently, as during the period of the Copenhagen discussions, to a deliberate intention to reduce it to less than 1. that is now happening. How is that happening? It's happening by fracking. It's happening by killing food supplies. It's a matter of starving people. It's a matter of imposing conditions which will kill them more rapidly. There's health conditions that will do that. So this is exactly what the Zeusian system has always done. That's what the Roman Empire did. The Roman Empire killed its own population and then sent them up there and began to call them Venetians at a later point. The fragments of the Roman Empire took their treasures, moved them up to the swamps in the northern part of the Adriatic, and gradually evolved a culture which we call Venice, well, known for its venery, for among other qualities. So that's what it is. So you have actually a phenomenon of actual living evil, a living satanic principle, which is embodied in the presence of the President of the United States right now. There's nothing in this president's behavior which does not correspond to a satanic view. What he's doing is satanic. But many of the Republicans are satanic. Many other strata. What happens is when the empire takes over and starts killing the people they don't like, what happens is the survivors decide they're going to join the Roman Empire and hope they can get a job. And not be eaten, but rather do some of the eating. And that's what we're in. We're in a point where you have a moral degeneration of our own population who are now living like parasites, like cannibals, on the lives of each other. And they may not actually eat their neighbors, but they certainly do the same things that would cause the eating of their neighbors to occur. And this is what we're at. So the question is, do we, who have the ability to understand history, to understand the difference between chemistry and arithmetic, which apparently most school students today don't know the difference. Most people who are educated as scientists today don't know anything about science. All they know is complicated, intertwined kinds of mathematics, exotic mathematics. They keep inventing new kinds of mathematics, but the net productivity of this mathematics production is downward. Why is it that mathematics, when applied in these forms, always results in a lower level of productivity? So you have more complicated programs and people which are less productive, which destroy productivity, and you say, this is science? This is not science. This is in science. Right? An incest science. Right? And so so therefore we who understand this, or are able to understand it, or have the guts to understand it, have the responsibility of speaking out loud and clear as to what the truth of this whole business is. What you're having now is you're having from a Russia which is bouncing back from a lot of problems and going into Asia, which is now saying, we are not going to accept this Zeusian principle which has taken over the transatlantic region. And we in the transatlantic region have to say, we are not going to put up with this any longer.
Now, we're in a kind of zone which is a famous apparent paradox. And this was characteristic of LaRouche's campaigns and LaRouche's speeches. Suddenly, there's an interpolation, apparently, of a discussion about mathematics and arithmetic versus science. And this seems to be, for many people, a jarring contrast to what the subject matter is. And it was this that was the most distinctive feature of LaRouche's presidential campaigns and of LaRouche's personality also. Because he thought and he behaved from the standpoint that all ideas were intelligible and all ideas were communicable to people who didn't think they could understand them. The whole conception that he operated by was that he could present to the American citizen and anyone else he spoke to the most profound and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature, directly, without a filter, without a dictionary, without a book for dummies. He thought that people were, as Biden once said, the problem with LaRouche is that he thinks people are smarter than they really are. I should note, to be fair to Biden, that he did say that after our associate Zeke Boyd and also Bill Ferguson had confronted him with the necessity for the tuning system to be tuned at C-256 in the middle of one of his campaign nights in New Hampshire. It was a comfortable setting, but he was a bit shocked. And he'll be even more shocked as the year progresses. Now, LaRouche thought it was deadly earnest for people to understand ideas like this. And as many here know, he was known as the most successful economic forecaster of our time. Over 9 very clear forecasts, which were economic. Some other forecasts, however, were downright eerie. There was the Kempinski Hotel occasion of Columbus Day 1988, when he talked about the idea of the unification of Germany with Berlin as its capital, 1 year before the Berlin Wall came down. And there's another occasion which we'd like to remind you of, which was January of 2001, when in a response to being asked the question about the nomination of Ashcroft as Attorney General, he made the following remarks.
Two things. First of all, when Bush put Ashcroft in as a nomination for the Justice Department, he made it clear the Ku Klux Klan was riding again. That clear. Now, maybe Bush didn't know what he was doing, but somebody in the Bush team did, and a lot of them had the voice to say something about it. Ashcroft was an insult to the Congress. If the Democrats in the Congress capitulate to the Ashcroft nomination, the Congress is finished. This is pretty much like the same thing that Germany did in February 28th, 1933, when the famous Notverordnung was established. This, remember, after the Reichstag burning, the Reichstag fire, that Goering, who commanded at that time Prussia, he was the minister president of Prussia at the time, set into motion an operation. As part of this, operating under the rules of Carl Schmitt, a famous pro-Nazi jurist of Germany, they passed this act called the Notverordnung, the Emergency Act, which gave the state the power, according to Schmitt's doctrine, to designate which part of its own population were enemies and to imprison them freely and to eliminate them. This was a dictatorship. Now remember that Hitler had come into power at January 30th of that same year, less than 2 months earlier. He'd come in as a minority party which had been discredited in the previous election. He was put in by bankers, including the father of President George Bush, the former president, Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush, as agent for Harriman in New York, worked with the British banks to put Adolf Hitler into power in January of 1933. At that time, Hitler was discredited and about to be bombed out. He was stuck into power because that was the last chance to get him in power. Everyone said, no, Hitler's not going to make it because the majority of the population is against him. Then on February 28th, 1933, the Notverordnung Act was passed on the pretext of the Reichstag's fire. And this established a dictatorship which Germany did not get rid of until 1945. Now, I'm not suggesting that the case of Ashcroft is comparable to the Reichstag's fire. but it is a provocation, a deliberate provocation. And if the Democratic Party and decent Republicans do not combine to throw that nomination back in the face of the nominator, this Congress isn't worth anything. That is because it will have surrendered its dignity. If you give those kinds of powers of a Justice Department to that Ashcroft and what he represents under that flag, you don't have any justice left in the United States. I would pull every string in the book that's serious as a legislative string to make sure that Ashcroft is not made the Attorney General. And I think that members of the Congress, members of the Democratic Party, should act on that point as if their life might depend upon it, because the lives of many of them might just depend upon that. You don't know. We're going to a period in which either we do the kinds of things I indicated in summary to you today, or else what you're going to have is not a government. You're going to have something like a Nazi regime. Maybe not initially at the surface. What you're going to have is a government which cannot pass legislation, of meaningful legislation. How does a government which cannot pass meaningful legislation under conditions of crisis govern? They govern in every case in known history by what's known as crisis management. In other words, just like the Reichstagsfire in Germany, how did that happen? Well, a Dutchman who was a known lunatic was used to set fires as a provocateur. And he went around Germany setting fires. And one night, with no security available for the Reichstag, he went into the Reichstag building and set the joint on fire. And Hitler came out and said, well, let's hope the communists did it. And Goering moved, and the Schmidt apparatus moved, that is of Carl Schmitt, the jurist. And they passed the Notverordnung. And on the basis of a provocation, that is crisis management, they rammed through the Notverordnung, which established Hitler as dictator of Germany. What you're going to get with a frustrated Bush administration, if it's determined to prevent itself from being opposed, its will, you're going to get crisis management, where members of the special warfare types of the secret government, the secret police teams and so forth, will set off provocations which will be used to bring about dictatorial powers into motion in the name of crisis management. You will have small wars set off in various parts of the world, which the Bush administration will respond to with crisis management methods of provocation. That's what you'll get. And that's what the problem is. And you have to face that.
And that was 8 months before 9/11. Now, today, as we anticipate the visit of President Donald Trump to London, and as I believe London anticipates the visit of President Donald Trump to London, it's relevant to consider that the persons who covered up that matter, including Robert Mueller, have become the adopted heroes of many people in our nation, many Hollywood actors, many TV comedians, many other characters who have become increasingly self-identified as political pundits. Identify Robert Mueller and his investigation as the cynosure of truth. But that apparatus, that police apparatus, that Department of Justice given those powers, is what the former FBI director, Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, James Comey, threatened the President of the United States with, and in this case, he refused to accept the threat. Matter of fact, the thing that is claimed to have occurred, which did not occur, that is, that the Russia hack story, has another significance. As in the case of Bertrand Russell, a provocation against Russia, the world's second major nuclear power, not necessarily second, by the way, in terms of power of nuclear weapons, simply the second other power. I just mean by that. Provocation of that nation under these circumstances of impending economic and increasing economic collapse can lead immediately to war, unprovoked war, and also unintentional war. But if that war were to occur, it would be nuclear. It's important to think, therefore, about the relationship between the forecasting method of LaRouche, his idea of a fight, together with forces around the world that he named at the beginning in his first statement. It's important to think about how that process of thinking in a time of crisis has to be applied by us right now in the days prior to the president sitting down with a probably apoplectic Prince Charles, who's also the sponsor of 3 of the main intelligence agencies of British intelligence, and prior to, of course, our memorial of next week. The next excerpt we want to show you is intended for the following. While people often say they, quote, like what Lynn talked about, they're usually not prepared to think about why their way of thinking about something is so different from his. There's an exchange. He had many exchanges with many people, many politicians and others over the years. But what would happen in the questions with those people or with yourself was usually the same. There's some assertion that is being made about how history works, usually by the questioner. The assertion is taken apart by LaRouche, deconstructed, something completely else is offered as a conception of history. And then the question goes in a completely different direction. And with LaRouche, what would happen often is that the questioner would suddenly be placed someplace that he or she never expected to go, on a topic that seemed to have nothing to do with what they were asking about, but which was actually the only standpoint from which the topic they thought they were asking about could be addressed. And this was the difference between what Schiller calls the bread-fed scholar and the universal mind. That people often ask questions and they don't perhaps mean it to be this way, but they're always asked from some pragmatic standpoint or pragmatic understanding of history. He didn't think that way. So his conception of history countered that. And so this is an example. This is from 2009, and this is an economist who's criticizing, of Republican persuasion, criticizing the Democrats. And he's trying to talk about why the Democratic Party hasn't implemented certain things, hasn't done certain things. And then LaRouche says, I don't think that characterizes the Democratic Party and the problem at all. And what he then does is he talks and begins to talk about generations and how you have to understand the Democratic Party from the standpoint of generations, and not generations in the Democratic Party, generations in the United States and the world.
Mr. LaRouche, as you know, most people will date many of the problems that we have in terms of the deregulation of the financial system back to the notorious Garn-St. Germain Depository Institutions Act of 1982. But financial deregulation actually started 2 years earlier. The fact is that a Democratic Congress and Democratic president, that president being Jimmy Carter, enacted the Monetary Control Act of 1980, which removed all remaining controls on interest rates and repealed the federal law prohibiting usury. It was the 1980 legislation, you will remember, that took the lid off banking and doomed the savings and loan industry, which was the mainstay that used to provide housing loans and home mortgages. The thrifts were able to raise capital because they were allowed to pay 0.5% more in interest to depositors. Bankers wanted them out of the way, and the Democratic Party obliged. Economist Albert Wolgenlower warned at the time, quote, that freeing the thrift and mortgage markets from government subsidy and guarantee is like freeing the family pets by abandoning them in the jungle. His prediction was swiftly realized. The 1982 legislation was actually Congress's clumsy attempt to make amends by expanding the lending powers of the failing S&Ls. It made things worse, and crisis followed a few years later, i.e. a bipartisan fiasco that politicians tried to conceal from voters. Getting the history right on this thing matters. And I think that it may help to explain why contemporary Democrats are so reluctant to enact more serious reforms, like capping interest rates, restoring the usury law, etc. The fact is, it would require them to clean up the mess that they made 30 years ago and finally acknowledge their costly errors. I'd like you to comment on this.
I don't think the Democratic Party, in terms of its composition of its membership, is actually the key to this problem. What had happened was you had the two Rockefeller brothers who were rivals, Nelson and David. Nelson, the oldest guy, and David the kid, the beetle collector. And they set up with European institutions, British and others, David operated out of Italy, the Trilateral Commission. And the Trilateral Commission was essentially a British operation working with a British ally, well, practically an errand boy, David Rockefeller, and his institution, and with other people. Now, Jimmy Carter is not really significant in this intellectually, because he had no idea what the hell he was doing. David Rockefeller came in with $3 million for him if he cared to run for president. And he said, okay, Mr. Rockefeller, yes, okay, so he took it. And then later, as is well known, Mr. Carter, President Carter, came to regret very much the role he'd played as president, and sort of went through like a convert at a revival session. He's realized there was something wrong with what he'd been doing. And the point is, he hadn't really been doing much of anything. He was a rubber stamp for people on policies he himself did not understand. But it was the apparatus organized around David Rockefeller with the Trilateral Commission, which not only ran the government under Carter, but also under Reagan. And in this case, George H.W. Bush, who could be sincere because he didn't know anything, went along with that. That was his baby. Then he became president and had the embarrassment of having more bank closures than anybody else, and he lost to Jimmy Carter, and he never forgave. I mean, he lost to forgive me. Forgive me if you're listening. So therefore, that's been the history. Now, what the process is, you go back. The turning point, there's two turning points which are crucial here. One is on the 13th of April, 1945, the day that Truman succeeded Roosevelt. And Truman's policies was an overthrow of the entire policy of Roosevelt and implicitly the Constitution of the United States. Truman had no middle name. There was only an S sticking out there. And he was totally a puppet of Winston Churchill. Remember, the policy was, Roosevelt's policy, as he told Winston during the war, Winston, when this war is ended, there's not going to be a British Empire. These people are going to be freed. We're going to help them develop when the war is over. They're going to be free. And Roosevelt had launched the intention for the United Nations organization as a receptacle for taking the existing nations, many of which had to be rebuilt already because of wartime conditions, and those nations which had a right to be free and independent, and creating a new organization called the United Nations Organization, which would be a vehicle for monitoring and discussion among this newly freed world of nations. No more colonies, no more dependencies. And what Roosevelt did, or what Truman did, Truman went exactly the opposite direction on the 13th of April, on the day after Roosevelt had died. He shut down large sections of the U.S. economy that Roosevelt had intended would be continued for part of this reconstruction of the planet. He went with the British on everything. The United States, which had been committed before then to freeing nations from slavery, went back to supporting the British and the Dutch and the French in recolonization and quasi-recolonization, that is, nominal freedom but under total British control or French control. And so this was what change was. Now, remember that you're talking about a phenomenon of generations here. You're talking about cultures and generations. I will be, in 2 months from now approximately, I'll be 87. I'm one of the last surviving World War II veterans. I mean, a very small number of us left as a percent of the population. And we're not given too much influence these days, particularly with this young jerk in the White House. So therefore, our generation came back from the experience of the 1930s and the war with certain ideas and certain commitments. Some of my associates from that generation became whores. They went with the opportunities rather than the conscience. But it's still in our society, as you saw that reflected in the election of Eisenhower. Eisenhower was popular because he represented, in the eyes of my generation, the leadership of the United States under wartime conditions. And he seemed to be a good man. And he was essentially a good man. But he came in an unfortunate time and became president. He was not in control of his own administration. So we had that. Then Kennedy came in, almost by a fluke, and also by the greed of his father. But Kennedy got off on a Franklin Roosevelt orientation. There's several influences on him to that effect. And it came to the showdown with Wall Street on the steel bosses. Then the big showdown came, for which he was killed. I think it's no secret now that he was killed because he, on the advice of General Douglas MacArthur and the support, concurrence of Dwight Eisenhower, both five-star generals at the time, retired, that the United States should not be engaged in a land war in Asia. Kennedy supported that bill, and for that reason he was killed. Johnson knew it. As he said later, he knew the rifles that had gotten, 3 rifles that had gotten Kennedy were aimed at his neck. Rifles borrowed from Spain by the same organization which was trying to kill General de Gaulle, President de Gaulle of France. So at that point, Johnson, scared, went into a land war in Asia. This crazy commission said, hang this bastard. He's guilty, he did it. That's it. Shut down the investigation. Nobody did it. It's just like what happened in New York. At a session, there was a little bit of investigation, but as we know now, the real culprits were never brought forward. So we've been in a process over generations of these kinds of successive experiences. We come into now the 68ers. The 68ers are victims of a cultural transformation, both in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere. The creative powers of mankind, which we recognize in achievements in scientific work, are not located in mathematics or mathematical practice. They're located in the creative powers which are identical with classical musical composition and classical poetry. It is the inspiration which we find expressed in classical poetry and in classical musical composition or other great classical art, which captures the mind's powers of imagination. And you will find that the greatest scientists, achieving scientists in history, have always been strongly influenced by the development of their character through classical art. Thus, the scientist who is steeped as a scientist in a classical artistic background and motivation is creative, whereas the one who is not involved in classical artistic legacies is not. He may be innovative, but he's not creative. Because the idea of discovery of a principle flows from the discovery in the imagination, in the classical imagination, the classical artistic imagination. So if you want to make an idiot, send him to study mathematics alone. He'll be an idiot in science. If he's inspired by classical artistic composition, you will find there's a discipline of the mind, as Shelley refers to this in his A Defense of Poetry, a discipline of the mind which has a disciplined conception of the imagination, based and rooted in the tradition of classical artistic composition. This is true in all language cultures, that the greatest feature of any language culture is its classic artistic tradition, where the imagination, the creative powers of the mind are developed. Then these creative powers of mind, faced with a problem expressed as mathematical physics, is able to see what the mathematical physics can never see, as Leibniz made this clear in his conflict with the people who came after him. The Descartes thing, Leibniz versus Descartes. Descartes is the mechanical man. You know, it's like a collection of dried turds, rattled around in his mind, as opposed to Leibniz, a man with great creative powers, expressed in every dimension, in the use of language, creating language, in poetry, in every aspect of life. What happened is we sent people to college in the post-war period in greater numbers than ever before. And they became what we call engineers. And engineers became a useful idea and also a dirty word. It's a useful idea in the sense that you could mass produce, relatively, a number of people who could do things, who had been trained to go through certain procedures and techniques. But with that, there'd been a loss of the power of the imagination. And you would find a correlation in history between, in what I knew, particularly in the Fusion Energy Foundation, that we would find a generation thing. The scientist who was a musician, and we had leading scientists largely in the Fusion Energy Foundation. The scientist who was a musician, a classical musician, or classical artist, was also creative in science, whereas the scientist who was not particularly creative in science. They may have been a genius, gimmickry, but not in insight into universal principles.
Of course, with Lynn, there's always more that one gets intrigued with and you can learn, but this issue of principle and what we are really trying to do in the course of our work in the organization these days, particularly in music, it's not different now than it used to be, but it's just more essential now than it ever used to be. That as the American population is confronted suddenly with a reality about which we have spoken for many decades, but which they, for many reasons, were unprepared to accept. And as the institutions of control and manipulation lose their power over their minds, the problem involved that people will have is, how do you choose between insanity at that point and a clear identification with truth? Because in other words, the world that we spoke of so much, and that we wrote about so much, and that we campaigned around so much, that was so rejected so much, is now about to manifestly be seen as the world that is. Reality is now about to manifest itself even to those who have been under the influence, for many different reasons, of illusion. Virtual reality is not about to triumph, as many are worried. It's not going to occur. The opposite is about to occur. And this is the way I think we have to think about our presidential campaign, but we also have to think about the idea of music and the arts, as Lynn has already identified it, as the power of politics. He wrote many pieces about this, and much of this will be discussed in the course of next week, so I don't think we need to go into that now. I do want to make sure that I make people aware of one specific matter so that as the President of the United States goes into London, you are aware of the circumstances in which he finds himself. So can we go to the House of Lords quote? And then we will go back to the video, but I need this for a moment. Yes. All right, this is from a report that was written by the House of Lords, UK Foreign Policy in a Shifting World Order. I want you to just know a couple of things. This is a context. The United States administration has taken a number of high-profile unilateral foreign policy decisions that are contrary to the interests of the United Kingdom. In particular, U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change, the Iran nuclear deal, and the UN Human Rights Council, and the imposition of trade tariffs on its allies undermine efforts to tackle pressing global challenges of critical importance to the United Kingdom. The government's response of maintaining its commitment to these agreements and institutions has been the right one. Next, please. I want to go past that. Let's go to, to 39. Okay. The difficulty that the United Kingdom and its allies have faced in trying to influence the United States demonstrates the challenge of working with the administration, meaning the Trump administration. How damaging this will be to what has hitherto been the United Kingdom's most important international relationship will depend on whether the current approach is an enduring trend. Next. Some of the foreign policy decisions of the United States administration do not stem solely from the election of President Trump. They represent a broader shift toward a more inward-looking U.S., which is less focused on the transatlantic alliance and multilateralism and the sense of the U.S. losing power to other sources. In its diplomatic relations with the administration, the United Kingdom should distinguish between those aspects of current U.S. foreign policy which are driven by the current president and those which are part of longer-term trends of divergence from the United Kingdom. That's a very important idea there. They recognize that their problem is not Donald Trump alone. They do not see their problem as being merely the Trump administration. They see their problem as being the United States. And the government's response to U.S. foreign policy decisions needs now more than ever to be closely coordinated with like-minded countries throughout the world. Okay. So that's relevant. As you noticed, I did say something about our presidential campaign, which might lead you to think or ask what that means. I mean, clearly, we have not announced, nor do I think we are going to be announcing, a presidential candidate. What is our presidential campaign? Well, to speak to that, I will allow Lyndon LaRouche to do that, and we will make a few comments at the conclusion of what he has to say.
We have to have a leading presidential candidate of the United States affirm what I have proposed be done. That is, the United States must propose to the governments of Russia, China, and India that these four major countries will agree to sponsor a committee, an alliance of powers, including other powers, to establish a fixed exchange rate financial or credit system internationally, of the type that Roosevelt intended in 1944, not what Truman did in 1945. What Roosevelt proposed was a credit system whose intention was to eliminate colonialism, especially British colonialism. And Roosevelt said that repeatedly, very clearly to Churchill. Winston, when this war is ended, Winston, we're not going to have your empire. We're not going to have colonies. These people are going to be free. They're going to have their own governments and no more empire. And are we going to do that? Well, we had the greatest military machine the world had ever known, a production machine, where the Nazis would produce in a few hundred pounds, we would produce in tons. Our soldiers were not well trained in general. They've just got into the service off the streets or out of the woods. It's a short time earlier. Trained in 16 weeks and a few other weeks and sent overseas to war. This is not really recommended army. But we had tonnage. Every man in service had tonnage behind him. And with that tonnage and that power of mobility and logistics that we had, we won the war. Together with other people who cooperated with us, with our aid of our tonnage. It was our tonnage that Russia depended upon, the Soviet Union depended upon, to defend itself against Hitler. It was tonnage that was required. Tonnage of material. So we had the greatest machine for production the world had ever known. At the end of the war, it had been built up in large degree for military purposes. But there's no difference between logistics for a military purpose and the technology required to build for an economy. Bridges, ships, railway systems, everything, machine tools. All of these kinds of things are just as much interchangeable with material for war and material for peace. Roosevelt's intention, as he stated clearly, was that once the war is ended, Winston, and this was in Casablanca, we are not going to have your system anymore. And he laid out a scheme for a large-scale development of Africa. We're not going to have colonies anymore. We're going to help these people have independent nations. We're going to cooperate with them. And we're going to eliminate your empire, Winston. Well, the problem is that Roosevelt died. And Truman was a stooge for the British. That's no exaggeration. So what Churchill did was enter into an alliance with Truman and with the British behind Churchill, and they decided they're going to start a preventive nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. Why? To defeat Roosevelt's intention. Because Roosevelt's intention was to take China, Russia, and the United States, who were the leading powers of the world at that moment, at the end of the war, and through a system of cooperation, redevelop the world, a war-torn, ruined world. So what did you do? You start a war with the leading allies and partners of the United States under Roosevelt. You start a war with Truman. against those same allies in order to preserve what? The British Empire. Instead of eliminating British colonies, Churchill and company, with Truman's support, backed the reinstallation. For example, under British orders, the Japanese troops which were in prison camps in Indochina were told to get out of the prison camps, pick up their weapons, and go back into the occupation of Indochina. Indochina had freed itself from French imperialism with U.S. backing. Ho Chi Minh was a friend of the United States, a friend of Roosevelt, a friend of Roosevelt's machine. We turned friends into enemies, allies into enemies. We helped the Dutch do the same thing in the Indies. We made a mess of the freedom of India a year after I left the place. Again, the British. So under Truman, we systematically destroyed Roosevelt's intention. Roosevelt's intention was we take our great economic machine, our agro-industrial machine for capital goods, and we use this weapon to free the subjugated people. And by doing so, to free the world from the damn British Empire.
So that's the presidential campaign. And that is what we are going to prosecute. And we are going to do that in the way that we have often attempted to do these things. There's no reason to wait for someone to take the office if someone is there in the office with that inclination. The important thing is to take the presidency. That is to say, the president is one individual, but the presidency is a process of institutional change. It's in our power, and uniquely in this case, in the power of those associated with Lyndon LaRouche and the LaRouche Political Action Committee, to clarify and to act in such a fashion that Americans of all persuasions, all different political backgrounds, join us in that effort, which is the historic effort bequeathed to us by the founders of this country. Campaigning against the British Empire is not a partisan issue. It is partisan against the British Empire, but it is not internally partisan to the United States. That is a requirement of the presidency. And for a change, someone happens to be there that is actually explicitly stating that that is their inclination. Our campaign on behalf of the American presidency has an additional requirement, and it is to represent this standard that you've seen here. And it is in that respect that we are going to enter now into a week of preparing for the triumph of Lyndon LaRouche, as that will be not merely expressed in an event, but a set of initiatives that will be coming from that occasion. So it has been spoken by LaRouche, and so it should be done.